A gilded skull, a cryptic message, and a secret buried in plain sight. Welcome to Silent Case Files. I am your host, Pendleton. Your thoughts bring this mystery to life. Where are you tuning in from today? I can't wait to read your comments. Let's begin. It was on one of those damp, cheerless mornings of late October that I found myself once again beneath the familiar gaslight glow of Baker Street, stirring my tea as Sherlock Holmes, cross-legged in the armchair opposite mine, sat silently contemplating the curls of smoke from his pipe. The fire crackled with minimal enthusiasm, much like London itself that week, drizzling, sullen, and altogether uninspiring. "Watson," Holmes said without looking up, "you have twice folded your newspaper and once sighed audibly. A man of your schedule only fidgets so when the weather forbids golf and the Lancet offers nothing new." I smiled and opened my mouth to reply when a sharp rap came at the door, precise, nervous, and urgent. Before Mrs. Hudson could reach it, Holmes had already risen and turned the knob. A short, wiry man stepped inside, his bowler hat gripped in his hands like a lifeline. He wore a crumpled suit of modest quality and exuded an air of barely suppressed panic. Beads of sweat dotted his brow despite the chill. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I am, and this is Dr. Watson. Please, sit. You have come a considerable distance, judging by the smudge of red clay on your left heel. Bristol or further?" "Bath, sir," the man confirmed, sinking onto the edge of the settee. "Paddington to here. First train this morning. I didn't know who else to turn to." "Then begin at once," Holmes said, lighting a second match, "but do so clearly. The truth seldom minds detail." The man introduced himself as Mr. Jasper Lovelace, assistant curator at the Holborn Museum of Art in Bath. His account began ordinarily enough, until it wasn't. "3 days ago," he said, "a crate arrived from the estate of the late Sir Julian Evercombe. It was part of a bequest. Odd curiosities and minor antiquities to be catalogued. The Evercombe family were known for collecting oddities, mostly dust catchers. But among the items was, well, something else." Here he paused, fidgeting with the rim of his hat. "It was a skull, gentlemen, a human skull, but gilded, gold leaf, meticulously applied, not ornamental, almost reverent. The thing was nestled inside a velvet-lined wooden box with no inscriptions. But within an hour of its arrival, my colleague, Miss Thea Morton, disappeared." Holmes leaned forward a fraction. "Disappeared?" "Vanished. Her coat remained on the hook, her handbag, untouched. She had gone nowhere and no one saw her leave. That night we found her brooch, snapped in two on the floor of the gallery, not 6 feet from the open crate." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "And the skull?" "It vanished the following morning." Holmes stood and crossed to the window, where the soot-stained view of London was as bleak as ever. "A young woman disappears, a gilded skull arrives, then vanishes. And you have told the police?" "Yes, but they dismiss it. They believe Miss Morton ran off. There was an unpleasantness a month ago with a wealthy donor, but she would not have gone like that, not without a word." Holmes turned back from the window. "Did you examine the box in which the skull arrived?" "Yes. Cedarwood, recently built, not old, but packed with straw that had, well, something odd. It smelled faintly of camphor, like something preserved. The museum's senior curator brushed it off." "And no inventory? No record of the skull being part of the bequest?" "None. Sir Julian's catalogues are notoriously disorganized, but this was not listed." Holmes regarded him intently. "Mr. Lovelace, you did well to come. When something is gilded, it is often to disguise rot beneath. Dr. Watson and I shall accompany you to Bath on the next train." Lovelace's face slackened in relief. "You will help then?" "I detest missing puzzles," Holmes said with a faint smile. "And a missing woman is no puzzle to delay." As we gathered our coats and prepared for the journey westward, I could not shake the image from my mind, a skull, veiled in gold, resting in velvet, and a woman gone without a trace. In my years with Holmes, I had seen many strange beginnings, but something about this one felt particularly foreboding. The journey to Bath was conducted under a mantle of grey skies and gentle rain. Holmes, as usual, passed the time in near silence, his gaze fixed through the streaked carriage window, as if extracting meaning from the mist-veiled countryside beyond. I refrained from breaking his reverie, having long learned that his mind worked most efficiently when undisturbed. Mr. Lovelace sat opposite us, alternating between wringing his hands and darting glances toward Holmes, as though seeking assurance without daring to request it. Upon arrival, the town wore its usual Georgian dignity, its honey-coloured stone buildings glistening under the sheen of recent rain. A carriage awaited us at the station, summoned by Lovelace before his departure. As we drove through the well-ordered streets, Lovelace provided further details. "Miss Morton was the museum's junior conservator," he said, his voice subdued but steady. "She was clever, insightful about provenance, deeply committed to her work. We collaborated on cataloguing the Evercombe pieces. She had an unusual sensitivity to objects, as if she could read their histories. That's why the skull disturbed her so." Holmes tilted his head. "How so?" "She grew quiet the moment she saw it, said it had a wrongness. Not merely that it was human, something else. She didn't elaborate." "A pity," Holmes murmured. We pulled up to the Holborn Museum, an elegant building set in a trimmed garden square. Inside, the scent of varnish, paper, and damp stone met us, familiar to any who have spent time in archives. We were shown through to the back galleries, where the bequest materials were temporarily stored pending cataloguing. The space was dim, the oil lamps flickering on polished glass display cases and crates in various stages of unpacking. Mr. Lovelace led us to a long table on which lay empty straw wrappings, lengths of velvet, and several open notebooks. The cedarwood crate, now bereft of its contents, sat in the corner. Holmes approached it at once. He knelt, examining the interior, and then running his fingers along the grain of the wood, pausing to sniff one corner. He opened his pocket magnifier and examined a small discoloration near the hinge. "Dr. Watson," he said, gesturing, "note this. A faint residue of golden leaf, barely visible, adhered to the inside lid. The skull was not carelessly placed. It was mounted, likely fastened here for display or restraint." He stood, turned to Lovelace. "Where precisely was the skull when first discovered?" Lovelace pointed to a low plinth at the centre of the gallery. "There!" It had been removed from the crate and left there temporarily. I had stepped away for not more than 10 minutes. When I returned, Thea was gone. The skull remained for the rest of the day until it vanished overnight. Holmes frowned. "And no other objects have disappeared?" "No, only those two." Holmes turned to the notebooks. He lifted one and flipped through it, pausing where the writing changed from Lovelace's angular script to something more rounded, Miss Morton's hand. The final page contained only a few lines. Gilded, not for ornament, symbol perhaps, not Roman, not Celtic, Persian, no, older, not just human, deliberate choice. Who gilds death? Holmes tapped the page with a fingertip. She was onto something. This is not merely a curiosity, it's a message. Or a ritual object, perhaps. You say Sir Julian Evercombe was known for eccentric acquisitions? Eccentric, yes. But he was methodical in his madness. He travelled extensively, Middle East, North Africa, Asia Minor, returned with odd relics, most of them donated or sealed in storage. Holmes set the notebook down. "Has anyone been asking about the bequest since its arrival? Any visitors?" Lovelace hesitated. "One man, a Mr. Ezra Groll, claimed to be a former associate of Sir Julian. Said he'd heard of the bequest through family channels and wished to view the pieces. He was polite, but there was something odd. He lingered too long, especially near the skull." Holmes looked up sharply. "Did he touch it?" "No, not that I saw, but he asked to handle it." I refused. "Did he return?" "Once. The following day, that was the morning the skull vanished." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You will give me a full description of this, Mr. Groll. Every detail you can recall. In the meantime, I must see Miss Morton's rooms." A short walk brought us to a modest flat above a bookshop on Queen's Parade. Thea Morton had lived alone, and her landlady, a prim widow named Mrs. Albright, let us in without hesitation. The sitting room bore the faintest trace of Miss Morton's character, a shelf of books on archaeology and folklore, sketches of ancient objects pinned to a corkboard, and a writing desk neatly arranged. Holmes passed through the room quickly, pausing only at the desk drawer, which he opened and examined. He withdrew a small, folded paper from beneath a stack of correspondence. "Uh-huh." He held it out to me. It was a hand-drawn symbol, 2 concentric circles, the inner one containing a crude depiction of a skull. Around the outer ring were tiny marks like glyphs or runes, unfamiliar to me. Beneath it, in pencil, she had written only, "Not decorative, protective?" Holmes tucked the paper into his coat. She was researching and beginning to suspect that the skull was more than macabre art. Back at the museum, Holmes requested access to the museum's correspondence records regarding the Evercombe estate. Lovelace hesitated, citing confidentiality, but Holmes's tone made resistance seem unwise. After a moment, he led us into the director's office, where a folio containing communications from the solicitor of Sir Julian's estate was produced. Holmes scanned quickly, muttering as he turned the pages. "Ah, here. An informal bequest of items formerly housed in the East Tower vault, per Sir Julian's 1872 instructions not to be inventoried posthumously. Curious?" He tapped the paper. "There's your anomaly. The bequest was not intended to be documented. The East Tower vault, does that mean anything to you?" Lovelace nodded. Sir Julian kept part of his collection separate from the rest. Uncatalogued, rarely shown. Which makes it the perfect place to conceal an object whose origins, or implications, he feared. Holmes rose. "We must visit the Evercombe estate. If the answers are not there, they are nowhere." "But the estate is sealed," Lovelace said. "The family line ended with Sir Julian. The grounds have been vacant for nearly 5 years." "All the better," Holmes replied, already moving toward the exit. A vacant estate leaves behind honest shadows and footprints. As we returned to the carriage, the autumn wind had stiffened, sending leaves skittering along the cobbled streets. Holmes's coat flared behind him as he turned back to me. "Watson, we are no longer dealing with mere disappearance. This skull, its vanishing, its symbolism has teeth. There is a ritual here, or the memory of one. And those who deal in such things rarely lose interest so suddenly." We climbed into the carriage once more, bound for Evercombe Hall, where the next layer of mystery awaited beneath dust, stone, and something older still. The ride to Evercombe Hall carried us deeper into the countryside, along narrow lanes where moss crept up stone walls and twisted trees bowed over our path like ancient sentinels. The afternoon sun, what little of it existed, had already begun to sink, behind a bank of clouds casting a pall of gloom over the landscape. Holmes, bundled tightly in his coat, sat with his eyes closed but clearly not resting. His fingers tapped a rhythmic pattern on the seat, the way they often did when he was forming chains of logic, invisible to the rest of us. Mr. Lovelace, less composed, watched the fields pass with a nervous intensity. "The hall isn't much now," he said at last. "Sir Julian maintained it more out of stubborn pride than any practical use. There's no staff, no electricity either, unless the generator in the carriage house still runs." Holmes's eyes opened. "I prefer candlelight when examining ancient places. It hides fewer sins than electric bulbs." Evercombe Hall emerged as we turned a final bend, a brooding silhouette of gabled roofs and ivy-cloaked stone, perched atop a low hill as though keeping watch over the fields below. The carriage crunched over gravel, coming to rest in front of a great wooden door banded in iron. The windows on either side were shuttered, and only a single rook protested our arrival from its perch atop the chimney. Lovelace led us through a side door, for the main entrance had long since rusted shut. The interior was a tomb of still air and muffled echoes. Dust floated like spectres in the beams of our lanterns. We passed through panelled corridors hung with threadbare portraits, dour Evercombes who stared down as though measuring our worth, and emerged into a cavernous drawing-room. The furniture was covered in sheets, and a sour, organic scent lingered faintly in the air. Holmes moved without hesitation, his steps soft on the wooden floorboards. "Where is the East Tower?" "This way," Lovelace said, holding his lantern higher. We followed him down a narrow passage, past a servant's staircase, and through an arched stone doorway. The air here was colder, damp with age. The stone floor gave way to creaking timber as we ascended a winding stair, the walls narrowing until we emerged into a circular chamber. At the top, it was bare but for a low cabinet, a covered table, and a tall window whose stained glass distorted the moonlight into red and gold smears on the floor. Holmes moved immediately to the cabinet, examining its lock. "This hasn't been forced," he murmured. "But see, scratches around the keyhole. Someone has opened it, recently and hurriedly." He produced a narrowed tool from his coat and inserted it with delicate precision. In a moment, the cabinet opened. Inside was a peculiar arrangement: a leather-bound ledger, a small sealed vial, and a carved wooden disc bearing the same concentric skull symbol Miss Morton had sketched. Holmes removed each item carefully and laid them on the table. He opened the ledger first. "Sir Julian's hand," Lovelace murmured. "I've seen it in letters." Holmes read aloud, turning pages slowly. "February 1872, the artifact arrived this week from Smyrna, uncatalogued, no official record, brought via private courier under cover of night. Description matches that in the Salamis manuscript, Gilded Skull, markings consistent with pre-Hellenic rites. Alleged to bring protection in death or possession, must be kept sealed, not exposed to prolonged touch." Holmes looked up. "Possession. A superstition, perhaps, but one he took seriously." He turned another page. "E.G. arrived again this morning. Demanded to see it. Greedy fool. Warned him again. To unseal it without ritual is folly." "E.G.?" I said slowly. "Ezra Grohl?" Holmes nodded. "It appears Mr. Grohl's interest dates back 50 years. Either he is impossibly long-lived, or, more likely, he's the son or heir of the original man, but the obsession is inherited." Lovelace had gone pale. "You think he returned for the skull, that he's behind Thea's disappearance?" "It becomes increasingly likely. But we must be precise in our suppositions. Superstition clouds motive." Holmes picked up the wooden disc, examining its edge under his magnifying lens. This is no ornament. See these grooves? It fits something. A stand or base, perhaps. If this was once affixed to the skull, it might have served as a seal or ward. I glanced at the vial. What of that? Holmes uncorked it cautiously and sniffed. He recoiled slightly. Camphor, mixed with pine resin, used in some preservation rituals, or to mask other smells. Note the seal cracked. Someone opened it. Suddenly, from somewhere below, a noise, faint, metallic, a clatter followed by silence. Lovelace nearly dropped his lantern. What was that? Holmes was already at the door. We are not alone. We descended swiftly, our lanterns casting jerky shadows along the staircase. In the main hall, silence returned, oppressive and complete. Holmes moved to the drawing-room and paused, holding up his hand. There, on the floor, unmistakable in the thick dust, were footprints. They led from the west window across the room and stopped abruptly beside the hearth. Holmes knelt. Look here. The prints are fresh, less than an hour. Narrow shoe, leather sole. Our visitor is light-footed, and here, see this slight drag in the left heel? An old limp. He rose and moved to the hearth. Watson, help me with this panel. We pushed against the wooden panelling beside the fireplace, and with a reluctant groan, it gave way to reveal a low passage. Of course, Holmes said. Old manor houses often have priest holes or smugglers' tunnels. This one's been recently used. We entered single file, ducking low. The tunnel was musty and tight, the walls weeping with condensation. After perhaps 40 feet, it widened into a circular, brick chamber. There, atop a pedestal in the centre, was the Gilded Skull. But something was different. Holmes approached cautiously, inspecting it without touching. It's been altered. The gold leaf, see? It's thicker in parts. Reapplied, likely to hide surface markings, but why return it here? I stepped forward and felt a chill pass over me, not from cold, but a primal unease. Lovelace whispered, What is that? Smell? Sulphur and decay, Holmes said. Someone attempted a crude ritual, not to protect but to invoke. He circled the pedestal and crouched suddenly. Look here, wax drippings, charred matches, and... He pulled a singed scrap of fabric from the floor. This is from a woman's blouse. Miss Morton may have been here, willingly or not. Then where is she now? That, Holmes said grimly, is the question. A sudden cry echoed faintly down the tunnel, distant but unmistakably human. Lovelace's face turned bloodless. That came from the upper floors. Holmes's face hardened. Then we are not merely investigating a relic. We are in the midst of a crime still unfolding. He turned on his heel, the lantern swinging as we hurried back through the tunnel. Somewhere in Evercombe Hall, the truth was still alive, and perhaps, just barely, so was Thea Morton. We emerged from the narrow passageway back into the drawing-room, our boots raising puffs of age-old dust. But Holmes did not pause. He led the way swiftly, retracing our steps through the corridor and up the servants' staircase, his lantern throwing flickering arcs of light across the walls. That distant cry, brief and muffled, still echoed in my mind. It had not been an illusion, of that I was certain. And Holmes, for all his rationality, moved with an urgency that confirmed he had heard it too. "Third floor," he muttered. "The acoustics suggest the source was above the east wing." Lovelace stumbled behind us, his breathing laboured, clearly unaccustomed to such exertion. I stayed close to him, more out of caution than concern. In old places like Evercombe Hall, shadows could do more than deceive the eye. They could conceal intent. Holmes pushed open a warped wooden door at the top of the stair. The hallway beyond was narrow and sagging, the ceiling sloped and cracked. Faded floral wallpaper peeled away in sheets. Dust choked the air. Doors lined the hall, most closed, some hanging crookedly from broken hinges. Holmes advanced slowly now, stopping to press his ear to each door before moving on. At the fifth, he halted. The knob bore fresh fingerprints in the dust. Without a word, he drew a small revolver from beneath his coat and turned the handle. The door creaked open into a large chamber, lit faintly by a tall, grimy window. Furniture, draped in ghostly white sheets, cast strange, bulging shapes into the room. And in the far corner, slumped against the wall, was a figure. "Thea Morton!" Lovelace gasped, rushing forward. But Holmes held him back. "No. Wait." The woman's arms were bound behind her, and a strip of linen gagged her mouth. Her eyes opened wide as she saw us, and she strained against her bonds. I crossed the room quickly and knelt beside her, checking her pulse. It was strong, thank God. She was shaken, pale, but uninjured. Holmes cut her free with a flick of his penknife. "Miss Morton," he said softly, "we have little time. Was it Groll?" She nodded rapidly, rubbing her wrists. "Is he still here?" Another nod, and she pointed toward the far wall, where an old dressing mirror hung at an angle. Holmes examined it, then rapped gently on its edge. It echoed oddly. Without hesitation, he pushed the mirror aside on its hinges, revealing another narrow passage. He peered inside, then stepped back. "Dr. Watson, remain with Miss Morton. Mr. Lovelace, light another lantern. I'm going after him." "Holmes, wait," I said. "If he's armed—" "He won't fire," Holmes replied. "Not here. Not with so much at stake." And then he disappeared into the dark. I helped Miss Morton sit up against the wall and removed the gag. She coughed, took several deep breaths, and then grasped my arm tightly. "He's mad," she whispered. "Utterly mad. Tell me everything you can." I stayed at the museum that night to work. I couldn't leave it alone. The skull, the symbols. It's not just an artifact, it's something more. And I wasn't the only one who thought so. Groll came in through the back door. He had a key. He must have stolen it from the maintenance office. What did he want? He said I had no right to interfere, that the skull was his by lineage, by ritual. He spoke of an order, something old. He said I'd opened a path that should have stayed sealed. When I tried to leave, he knocked me unconscious. I woke up here. You were moved through the tunnel? I think so. It smelled of mildew and wax. I remember being carried. He said he was preparing it for something. He kept muttering about the right. At that moment, we heard a sharp shout, Holmes's voice, followed by the unmistakable thud of a scuffle. I sprang to my feet, but Miss Morton clutched my arm again. "There's something else," she said. "It's not just about the skull. There's a journal, Sir Julian's. It contains names, ritual notes. Groll's grandfather was part of it. But the last entry, it warned of something buried on the grounds. A vault. Groll believes the skull is a key." I hesitated, absorbing this, then said, "You're safe now? We'll get to the bottom of this." She nodded, though fear still shone in her eyes. I left Lovelace to tend her and followed the passage Holmes had taken. It descended steeply, the walls growing damper and closer. I could hear voices ahead, Holmes's sharp, commanding tone, and another, lower, erratic. "I told you," the second voice cried. "It was his, my grandfather's. It was stolen, hidden away like a sin." I turned a corner and found them. Holmes standing at the base of a narrow stair, his revolver trained on a thin, wild-eyed man in a long coat. Groll. His face was pale and sunken, his eyes burning. He clutched something close to his chest, a velvet pouch. Holmes's voice was calm. "You'll hand it over, Mr. Groll. Whatever illusions of inheritance you entertain, you've crossed a boundary. Abduction, trespass, desecration. "It doesn't matter," Groll shouted. "You don't understand. This wasn't just an heirloom, it's a beacon. Sir Julian didn't hide it, he feared it. But the rite must be completed. The glyphs on the skull, they're a map." "A map to what?" Holmes asked. Groll laughed, a chilling, splintered sound. "To the resting place, to him, the one they tried to bury beneath salt and oak. The skull is the first marker, the vault, beneath the orchard. It's waiting." Holmes stepped forward. "Then you'll show us." Groll took a step back. "I'll do what must be done." But Holmes was faster. He lunged, striking Groll's wrist. The pouch fell. Groll tried to run, but I tackled him, pinning him against the damp stone. Holmes retrieved the pouch and opened it carefully. Inside was the skull. It looked different now, darker, as though the gold leaf had dulled. Strange lines marred its surface, curling glyphs that writhed in the flickering lantern light. "We must remove it from this place," Holmes said, "and the journal. We need to learn what Sir Julian knew, what he was trying to contain." We brought Groll back to the upper floor and summoned the local constable. As Groll was led away, still muttering about the vault and the rites, Holmes stood by the window, watching the clouds drift past the gables of Evercombe Hall. Miss Morton, steadied by tea and blankets, approached him. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Thanks, Sir Julian," Holmes replied. "He tried to bury a secret that others were too foolish to leave undisturbed. We were merely the last to follow the trail." She looked at the skull, now rewrapped in linen and resting inside a lead-lined box from the museum. "You think it's finished?" Holmes's expression was unreadable. "I think this is only the surface of something older and deeper. The real question, Miss Morton, is whether Groll uncovered a truth or merely succumbed to a myth." I saw her shiver, not from cold. As we prepared to depart, Holmes turned to me with a small smile. "Well, Watson," he said, "we came looking for a puzzle in gold and found a labyrinth of madness instead, but I dare say this gilded skull has yet to yield all its secrets." And as the carriage rolled away from Evercombe Hall, I could not help but glance back at the looming tower where something waited still, unspoken, unseen, but no longer quite asleep. The following morning brought a brisk wind and the kind of pale sunshine that seemed more an apology than illumination. We breakfasted in a modest inn on the outskirts of Bath, our table by the window, overlooking a sloping green hedgerow and distant rooftops. Holmes ate little, as was his habit, when a case occupied his thoughts, though he did accept a cup of the innkeeper's strong black coffee, which he sipped absently, while his gaze remained fixed on the skull, now sealed in its lead-lined box. Beside him lay the journal of Sir Julian Evercombe, unlocked and partially transcribed during the early hours, thanks to Holmes's wakeful scrutiny and my long-practiced habit of writing at his dictation. "It becomes clearer," he said finally, tapping one of the handwritten pages. "Sir Julian was not merely a collector of oddities. He was a man haunted by something, whether real or imagined, that followed him back from his travels." "He spoke of rites and warnings," I said, "and of something buried beneath the orchard. You think Groll was telling the truth?" Holmes gave a non-committal shrug. "Groll may be unstable, but he's not a fantasist. His account aligns with Sir Julian's. More tellingly, his obsession mirrors the man's descent into fear. It may be coincidence, or it may be inheritance of a sort far stranger than property." He leaned forward and opened the journal again, pointing to a passage I had transcribed under his dictation. The object arrived cloaked in symbols, wrapped in the linen of antiquity, not cloth of recent weave. Beneath the gold, teeth, human, no trace of carving, a skull gilded not as tribute, but as prison. Glyphs match those in the temple at Hattusa. Guardian signs. Guardian signs? I echoed. Against what? That is the question. Holmes stood. We are returning to Evercombe Hall. But the case, surely with Groll arrested and Miss Morton recovered. It is unfinished, he said, donning his coat. The skull is no ordinary relic, and Sir Julian's notes are growing more erratic the further we read. If there is a vault, as Groll and Sir Julian both suggest, then it is no metaphor. And if the orchard conceals what Sir Julian feared, we must see it ourselves. We arranged for the museum to secure the skull under lock and key with trusted authorities, then rode once more to the hall, this time accompanied by a local constable, Inspector Braithwaite, a tall, straight-backed man with a weathered face and an open mind. Holmes had briefed him with care, choosing his words with a delicacy I had come to recognize as the difference between cooperation and bureaucratic resistance. "I don't know what you expect to find in an orchard," Braithwaite said as we dismounted and made our way through the garden gates. "But I'm told to assist, you'll have it." The orchard was behind the east wing of Evercombe Hall, beyond a crumbling stone wall and an iron gate seized with rust. It was overgrown now, wild branches snarled and heavy with dead fruit. The trees bore the stunted look of age, and the air had a stillness about it that felt unnaturally complete. Holmes paced between the trees, measuring steps, muttering measurements from Sir Julian's notes. 70 paces from the east gable, 3 yards west of the sundial stone. He stopped beneath a gnarled old apple tree whose roots buckled the earth. Here. We fetched spades and lanterns from the carriage, and together we began to dig. The soil was rich but heavy and laced with fine roots. For nearly an hour we unearthed nothing but damp loam and broken shale. Then Holmes struck wood. "Careful," he said, clearing the top layer. A box, or perhaps a lid, emerged, rotted at the edges but intact. As we scraped away the surrounding dirt, the outline of a rectangular trapdoor revealed itself. Inspector Braithwaite drew back. "There's something built here. Old brickwork." With effort, we lifted the trapdoor. A breath of stale, cold air rose up, thick with earth and something more acrid. A stone stair descended into blackness. Holmes lit a lantern and stepped down without hesitation. I followed with Braithwaite behind me, his hand on his truncheon. The stair led into a vaulted chamber of ancient stone, dry despite its age. The walls bore carvings, symbols that matched those on the skull and the wooden disc in the tower. In the center of the room, half submerged in soil and moss, was a stone sarcophagus. There were no inscriptions, only the same concentric ring and glyph markings etched deeply into the lid. We circled it slowly, reverently. The chamber held the air of something sacred or profane. Holmes examined the base of the sarcophagus, then crouched beside a shattered alcove in the wall. "This was disturbed," he said. "Recently. See how the dust is unsettled, and here, impressions in the moss. A tripod or some similar device." "Ritual paraphernalia?" I asked. "Likely. Groll had already found this place before we did, but he took nothing. Either he feared what lay within, or he failed to open it." Inspector Braithwaite cleared his throat. "And what is it you suppose does lie within?" Holmes straightened. "Let us find out." I admit to a moment's hesitation, but Holmes pressed his hands to the edges of the lid, and I joined him. Together we shifted it inch by inch. The stone gave with a groan, and inside, nothing. No skeleton, no bones, only dust and the remnants of a linen wrap long since disintegrated. But there was a hollow beneath the dust, a depression shaped to cradle something. "A skull," Holmes said. "This is where it was kept originally. Sir Julian removed it, transported it to the tower, perhaps after Groll's ancestor left. But why gild it? To prevent something from escaping, or to honour it, or both. We cannot know for certain. He turned to the wall, running his fingers along the carved glyphs. But I suspect Sir Julian believed that the act of containment was as significant as the object itself. Braithwaite muttered, "More like he lost his mind." "Perhaps," Holmes said quietly. "Or perhaps he saw too much of it." We resealed the vault, taking sketches and rubbings of the carvings. Holmes, with his usual thoroughness, photographed the site with a portable camera before we returned to the surface. Back in the orchard, the light had dimmed, the clouds had thickened into a low, heavy ceiling. As we walked back to the carriage, Holmes said, "There is no crime left to pursue. Groll will face charges for abduction and trespass. The skull is secure, but I suspect this will not be the last time we encounter what Sir Julian unearthed." I asked, "Do you believe he was part of a cult, an order?" "Not a cult, no, more a silent tradition, an inheritance of knowledge passed privately, dangerously. I believe Groll was raised on fragments of it, just enough to act rashly, without wisdom." We passed through the gate, and Holmes paused to look back at the orchard. "There are more Evercombes buried here," he said. "And more secrets." He turned to me, that familiar glint in his eye, not joy nor triumph, but the sharp glimmer of unfinished thought. "But for now, Watson, we have done what was needed. We have pulled one gilded puzzle into the light. Let us hope the shadows that surround it do not grow curious enough to follow." And so we left Evercombe Hall once more, leaving behind a vault, a name, and the whisper of something old buried beneath orchard roots. We returned to Baker Street 2 days later, under skies that had brightened but not cleared. London, as ever, greeted us with its usual clamour, carriages rattling over cobbles, the shrill calls of newsboys, the tang of coal smoke clinging to every brick and coat. Yet despite the return to familiar surroundings, there remained something unsettled about Holmes. He was not morose, but pensive, his movements deliberate, his thoughts elsewhere. After we'd taken our seats by the fire that evening, with a glass of claret between us and the case papers laid out on the table, I finally asked what troubled him. "You've been silent since we left Bath," I said, breaking the stillness. "The skull is secure, Groll is in custody, and Miss Morton is recovering. Yet you've hardly spoken. Do you not consider the matter closed?" Holmes tapped the bowl of his pipe gently on the edge of the hearth. "It is closed in the eyes of the law, Watson, but the law and truth are not always companions." I frowned. "You believe we've missed something?" "I believe," he said slowly, "that what we encountered was only the surface of a deeper web, woven over decades, perhaps centuries, and while we have touched one thread, others remain hidden." He stood and moved to the table, drawing out a folded sheet of paper. "This," he said, "arrived while we were en route, from Miss Morton." I unfolded the note. It was brief, written in a firm hand, but with urgency beneath the lines. "Mr. Holmes, while reviewing Sir Julian's remaining correspondence, I discovered references to a second object, something he called the Mirror Stone. He believed it paired with the skull and was never meant to be separated. The final page, in his private diary, ends with the words, 'If the skull is the lock, the mirror is the warning.' I will send more as I find it." "T. Morton?" I looked up. "A mirror? Do you suppose he meant that literally?" Holmes returned to his chair, eyes gleaming. "That is the question, Watson. The mirror is the warning. A curious phrase. One does not gild a skull to lock it away unless it contains something, be it belief, memory, or malice. If this mirror exists, it may explain what Sir Julian feared most. But why mention it only obliquely? Why hide it from the inventory as he did the skull?" Because it was meant to be forgotten, Holmes said. And what is meant to be forgotten is often what ought most to be remembered. We sat in silence for some minutes, each lost in thought, until Holmes rose suddenly and crossed to the shelf where he kept a collection of rare monographs, most dealing with arcane subjects, some so obscure I had never heard of the authors. He withdrew a slim volume bound in green cloth. On Relics of Power in Anatolian Ritual by Professor Jacob Hellberg, he said, handing it to me. Published 1868, Hellberg was an eccentric archaeologist who corresponded briefly with Sir Julian. Note this chapter. I opened to the marked page. It contained a sketch, a skull, rendered in precise ink lines, its surface covered in swirling marks and concentric circles. Beside it, a stone disc with a mirror-polished face. The mirror stone, I read, said by the hill priests of Cappadocia to reflect the soul of he who dared gaze into it, paired with the skull of the twice-buried man, said to reveal the unspoken truth that precedes madness. More poetry than science, I said. Undoubtedly, Holmes replied, but legends often contain truths disguised for survival. If the mirror exists and Sir Julian brought it to England, then someone else may be seeking it. I hesitated. You believe Groll had knowledge of this second artifact? I believe, Holmes said, that Groll was incomplete. Driven by inheritance, but blind to its full meaning. His mutterings of the right, his obsession with completing what was begun. Those are the actions of a man with pieces of a puzzle and no picture. He turned to the fire. I've asked Miss Morton to remain in Bath and continue combing Sir Julian's archives. Meanwhile, I've sent inquiries to various collectors and auction houses regarding Anatolian artifacts acquired discreetly during the 1870s. I suspect the mirror, if it exists, never reached public record. That evening passed in quiet speculation, broken only by Holmes's occasional notes in the margin of Hellberg's monograph. It was not until the following morning that the next piece of the puzzle arrived, again in the form of a letter. This time it bore the wax seal of the British Museum. Holmes slit it open, scanned the contents, and smiled faintly. A colleague in the Near Eastern Antiquities Department has responded. There is a record, unusual, incomplete, of an item matching our mirror's description, donated anonymously in 1874, withdrawn from display in 1875 following complaints of vertigo and nervous excitability among museum staff. The artifact was placed in secure storage and forgotten. He tossed the letter to me. They've agreed to grant us access this afternoon. By 3 o'clock, we stood in the museum's long, echoing hallways, escorted by a young assistant with red-rimmed eyes and ink-stained cuffs. He led us through several locked doors and into a restricted storeroom where rows of cabinets held a silence more profound than any library. "This is it," he said, unlocking a long drawer. "Shelf 9K?" Inside was a stone disc, perhaps 10 inches across, its surface polished to a dark, glassy sheen. Around its edge were faint engravings, glyphs nearly worn away by time. Holmes donned gloves and lifted it gently, turning it beneath the light. Unmarked, heavy, composition, obsidian, I suspect, ancient. The assistant hovered nervously. They said it caused episodes, headaches, dizziness. One assistant claimed to hear a voice whisper his name. I dismissed this with a smile, but Holmes remained grave. "Imagination is a powerful accomplice," he said, "and fear, once planted, can water itself." We took the mirror to a side room for closer examination. Holmes produced the wooden disc from Evercombe Hall, the one found beside the skull in the East Tower. The carved symbols on its edge matched those on the mirror's rim. "They were meant to be joined," Holmes said, "one to hold, one to reflect." He pressed the two together gently. They clicked into place with a satisfying firmness. There was no flash of light, no tremor, only the mirror whole again. Holmes stared into it, and after a moment he frowned. "I see my reflection, and yet," he murmured, "something is off. My image delays a fraction of a second." I looked. At first, I saw nothing amiss. Then I noticed it. The tiniest hesitation, as though my movements were echoed rather than mirrored. And stranger still, the room behind me in the glass seemed subtly changed, darker, the corners deeper, the light duller. Holmes snapped it shut. "Enough," he said. "It must be resecured, immediately." "But what does it mean?" "It means," Holmes said grimly, "that Sir Julian's warning was not metaphorical. This is no simple artifact. It is an aperture, a boundary. And the skull, its pair, is not the end of a tale, but the beginning. We returned the mirror to its casing and left instructions for it to be resealed under the museum's highest security classification. The assistant, pale but obliging, promised to alert only the head curator." Back on Baker Street, Holmes lit a fire and stood before it, deep in thought. "This case began with a disappearance," he said quietly. "Then it became a theft. Now it reveals a history written not in law, but in fear." "And what of Groll?" I asked. Holmes sighed. "We must speak to him. He may know more than he realized. If he inherited beliefs, he may have inherited truths as well." He turned to me. "We must prepare, Watson. We are not chasing criminals now. We are pursuing shadows. And as Sir Julian warned, some locks are better left sealed, not because they failed to open, but because they opened too well." I felt the chill of the words linger longer than the wind outside. It was a bleak and wind-bitten morning when Holmes and I made our way to Holloway Prison, where Ezra Groll was being held, pending his formal arraignment. The prison loomed with all the grimness of institutional architecture, a great slab of soot-darkened brick and barred windows that gave nothing back to the grey sky above it. Yet Holmes strode forward with the same composure he reserved for fine parlours and fog-drenched crime scenes alike. A warder led us through a labyrinth of corridors until we reached a cold, narrow chamber, its stone floor wet with condensation. Groll was brought in under close watch. He looked different now, hollow-eyed, paler than when we last saw him, his movements subdued. The madness that had danced at the corners of his expression at Evercombe Hall had dulled to a kind of weariness, as if the man had glimpsed something and now wished he had not. He sat opposite us, shackled, and gave a slight nod as if recognizing old adversaries. "You've come to gloat, Mr. Holmes?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "On the contrary," Holmes replied. "I've come to ask questions, and you're going to answer them, if only to unburden your own troubled mind." Groll let out a bitter chuckle. "Troubled? You think that's new? My family has been haunted for generations. My grandfather spent the last 15 years of his life speaking in riddles to locked doors." "Tell me about him," Holmes said. "The elder Groll. He was close to Sir Julian." "Too close," Groll muttered. "They met abroad, Cappadocia, I think, or somewhere near it. There was a dig. Something was uncovered, a vault, beneath an abandoned monastery. Julian wrote letters about it. My grandfather preserved them. They called it a rite of containment, a warning passed down through centuries." Holmes leaned forward. "And the skull?" "It was part of it. A relic, a warning. But it wasn't just a skull, you see. It was used in something old, forgotten before your precious Roman history even began. When Julian returned to England, he took the skull with him and sealed it away. He said it had to be gilded as tradition dictated, gold to trap the essence. He wrote that in his diary." "And the mirror?" I asked. Groll's eyes flickered with unease. he feared it more. The mirror was meant to remain with the skull. It was the twin. The skull contains, the mirror reveals. That's what the inscription said, but Julian broke the pair apart. Hid the mirror in London and the skull at Evercombe. He hoped dividing them would prevent the door from opening. Holmes's eyes narrowed. What door? That's the thing, Grohl said. There's no literal door, it's symbolic, a boundary of the mind, of perception. He believed the pairing of the two would allow one to see in a way man was not meant to, see into a place not built for reason. He called it the second reflection. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. So, when you recovered the skull, what did you intend? Grohl's hands clenched slightly in their restraints. I thought I could finish what my grandfather couldn't, complete the rite, close the circle, but I was wrong. He leaned forward, a sudden intensity in his voice. When I placed the skull near the mirror, just for a moment I saw things. My reflection moved before I did. The air turned cold. I could hear a sound like whispering from beneath the floor, something ancient stirring. I fled, I sealed it again. Holmes's voice was even. So you failed. No, I succeeded, just enough to be terrified. There was a silence, heavy with what he did not say. Then Holmes stood. You will remain here, but I will ensure no one touches either object again. That will be your only contribution to something much older than any of us. Grohl said nothing more as we turned to go. But just before the door was shut behind us, I heard him whisper one final thing. It wants to be reunited. We returned to Baker Street under a sullen sky, the weight of Grohl's words following us like an unseen presence. Holmes was quiet as we mounted the steps, and when we were once again in the warmth of our sitting room, he paced slowly before the fire, hands behind his back. He is not lying, he said at last. There are many varieties of madness, but Grohl's terror is genuine. He saw something, perhaps not supernatural, but certainly beyond his comprehension, and that, Watson, is the true nature of horror. I poured us both a brandy. Then what is our next step? Lock away the mirror and skull forever, entrust them to some vault and let time do the forgetting? I would, Holmes said, were it not for the final puzzle. He pulled from his coat the last pages of Sir Julian's diary, those recovered by Miss Morton and sent by telegram the night before. He laid them on the table. The final entry read, "The binding is incomplete. They must never reflect each other again. The gilding cracks, the mirror shows more each time. I saw her face yesterday, Thea, but she has not been born yet. I must bury the stone, I must warn them." He pointed to the last line. I saw her face yesterday, Thea. Thea Morton? I asked in disbelief. Holmes nodded slowly. Sir Julian died in 1881. Miss Morton was born in 1895. We both fell silent. The diary page sat there between us, its handwriting crisp, steady, rational. Not the ravings of a man in his dotage, not the imaginings of a febrile mind. Something else. Holmes said, almost to himself, the mirror doesn't reflect, it predicts, it reveals threads, possibilities, not yet realized, perhaps only visible when paired with the relic it was bound to. That's madness, I said with little conviction. A mirror that sees the future? No, Holmes replied. Not madness, merely a science we have not understood. He crossed to the cabinet and opened the drawer where he had stored the photograph of the skull and mirror, now reunited briefly in the museum's laboratory. Watson, look here. I took the photograph. It showed the objects side by side, yet in the reflection on the mirror's surface, the background of the laboratory was subtly different. A figure stood just beyond the photographer's shoulder. A woman, barely visible, but familiar. It was Miss Morton. But she wasn't present, I said. She never went to the museum with us." Holmes sat down, steepling his fingers. "We are out of the realm of detection, Watson. We have strayed into the geometry of time, of perception. And while I abhor superstition, I trust evidence. Something in these relics defies what we call reality." I stood and began to pace. "What are you suggesting, that we destroy them?" "No," Holmes said. "That would be arrogant. We do not understand them well enough to know what harm that might unleash." He looked at me, eyes burning with rare seriousness. "We must contain them. But more than that, we must find out who else knows. Sir Julian had a network. He corresponded with others, Helberg certainly, but perhaps more. If any of them still live, or left written legacies, we must find them, because I believe the skull and the mirror are only two parts of a larger mechanism, and someone, perhaps more than one, is still looking to assemble the rest." I nodded slowly. "Then this case, it isn't closed." Holmes smiled faintly. "No, Watson, this is no longer a case. It is a warning." Outside, the wind stirred the leaves in the street and whispered against the window pane. And for a moment I thought I saw my own reflection move just a fraction before I did. I did not look again. The days that followed passed with a strange sense of stillness, the kind that belies the quiet hum of things moving just beneath the surface. Holmes became more withdrawn than usual, though not in his despondent moods of old, nor in the excitable flare of intellectual ecstasy. It was a meditative state. He read voraciously, pored over ancient texts from obscure corners of the world, corresponded with professors of antiquities and arcane philosophy, and sent coded telegrams at all hours. Something about this case, if it could still be called that, had struck deeper than the ordinary. I, too, found myself troubled. The final pages of Sir Julian's journal, the unnerving photograph of Thea Morton's ghost-like figure, reflected where she could not have stood, and Groll's chilling last words all swirled through my mind in restless cycles. For all my training as a man of science, my time with Holmes had taught me that truth sometimes lived in the folds between reason and imagination. This was one of those times. It was 4 days after our visit to Holloway that a breakthrough arrived, wrapped, as so many of Holmes's revelations did, in the drab brown paper of a parcel delivered by a breathless boy. Holmes slit it open with a letter opener and withdrew a thick, leather-bound volume, brittle with age, wrapped in oilskin. "It's from Professor Elrich," he said, "at Göttingen." "Who?" I asked. "Anthropologist, specialist in Indo-European folklore and ritual systems. He was a correspondent of Sir Julian's and, according to his last telegram, had acquired a copy of a text known as the Canticles of the Rootless Tree. It's referenced obliquely in Helberg's writings and appears to have informed much of Sir Julian's final efforts." He opened the book with careful fingers. The paper was thin and yellowed. The text was printed in German and Latin, with extensive marginalia in Elrich's looping handwriting. It was obscure, ritualistic, poetic, and terrifying. We spent the better part of that day translating sections. The content was haunting. The skull is the seed, the mirror is the eye. When they are brought together beneath the eclipse, the path is shown, the path to the silence before names. Those who carry the mark of the Gilded Keeper may pass unseen into the reflection, but only once. Thereafter they are known. The fruit of the rootless tree grows downward, feeding on what is forgotten. Holmes laid the book aside after several hours, his face taut with mental strain. "Sir Julian feared something real," he said. "Not necessarily supernatural, but a system, an old belief, an architecture of the human mind meant to interface with symbols as gates. If the skull and mirror together form an axis, then somewhere, Watson, There is a third point. A triangulation? Precisely. Holmes stood and strode to the window. The canticles refer to three components: skull, mirror, and gate. We've identified two. The third, if it exists, is the location. A place where, under certain conditions, the path is opened. I rose. Then we must find it before someone else does. We already may be too late. That evening brought yet another letter, this time from Miss Morton. It was hastily written, the ink smudged in places. Mr. Holmes, urgent. I visited the crypt beneath Evercombe Hall again today. A portion of the vault wall, previously solid, has collapsed. Whether due to age or tampering, I cannot say. But within I found another chamber, inside an object buried in lead and clay, a black cube carved with the same markings as the skull and mirror. I have not opened it. I await your guidance. T.M. Holmes's hand tightened around the letter. She's found it. Found what? The third, the gate. We were on the next train to Bath by nightfall, accompanied by Inspector Braithwaite, whose good sense and loyal discretion had proven themselves. The journey passed in thoughtful silence, broken only by Holmes asking after the position of the moon. Waning, I replied. 3 days from the new moon. Not yet an eclipse, then, he murmured, but close enough for belief to stir belief. We arrived at the Holborn Museum well past midnight. Miss Morton met us at the side entrance, visibly pale and anxious, her lantern casting long shadows in the corridor. I locked the vault again after I found it, she said. But there was a presence. I felt it. Holmes said nothing but nodded gravely. She led us through the back halls, through the gallery, and down to the museum's storage cellars, where objects were kept in climate-controlled vaults. At the far end of a narrow hallway stood a reinforced door. She unlocked it. The chamber beyond was small and lined with stone, and there, on a linen-covered plinth, sat the object. A cube, about 8 inches to a side. Black stone or hardened resin, slick with age and marked with the same glyphs that now haunted our thoughts. It was bound with clay, cracked in places. Lid lines ran around its edges like veins. Holmes approached it slowly, reverently. "This is not a container," he said. "It is the keystone." He drew from his coat a long silk scarf and used it to wrap the cube. "We're not opening it here." "Then where?" Braithwaite asked, clearly unnerved. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Where it belongs, beneath the orchard, at Evercombe Hall. Sir Julian built the lock, and we must understand why." We made for the hall in the pre-dawn dark. The fields were stiff with frost and silence. Not a sound stirred among the hedges. The trees of the orchard stood like mourners waiting for a bell to toll. Down once again into the vault we went, Holmes first, then myself, Miss Morton, and Braithwaite bringing up the rear, with his lantern raised high. Holmes laid the cube upon the stone sarcophagus beside the depression where the skull had once rested. "They were meant to align," he said. "See this groove? It's not ornamental, it's a socket. Skull, mirror, gate, body, sight, and place." "What happens now?" I asked. Holmes looked around. "Nothing. If we do—"
"Nothing." And then Miss Morton whispered, "It's humming." I froze. A sound, not heard but felt, vibrated faintly through the stone beneath our feet. The cube emitted a low, resonant pulse, like the echo of a cathedral bell heard underwater. "The resonance," Holmes said slowly. "They're attuned. The mirror and skull must be nearby." Miss Morton nodded. "I brought the mirror. I couldn't leave it behind, not after what I saw." She opened a case and withdrew the obsidian disc, its polished surface dull in the lantern light. As Holmes aligned the three, skull, mirror, and cube, a sudden shift seemed to pass through the chamber. The air grew heavier, the carvings on the wall shimmered faintly. I took a step back. "Holmes!" "I know," he said. "This is not just a chamber, it is a circuit. Sir Julian designed it to trap something old, not of form or flesh, but of concept, of presence." The mirror began to fog over, not with moisture, but with shadow. Shapes moved behind its surface, flickering, shifting. Miss Morton gasped. "I see it again, her face, not mine, but close." Then Holmes did something I did not expect. He touched the mirror's surface with a gloved hand. There was a flicker of light, and then nothing. The resonance stopped. The vault was silent. Holmes turned to us, breathing heavily. "I closed it," he said, "for now." "How?" I asked. He pointed to the cube. "The alignment was incomplete. That was the safeguard. Sir Julian knew that curiosity alone would not unlock the path, but intent might." I helped Miss Morton to sit. Her hands were shaking. Braithwaite cleared his throat. "And what now, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes looked at the sealed cube. "Now," he said, "we bury them, deep, together, so that no single piece can be used again." He looked up at the carved ceiling of the vault. "And we hope that what sleeps behind the mirror does not remember the world we've denied it." The rest of us could only nod and pray it was enough. The burial took place at first light. The sky over Evercombe Hall was a washed-out grey, streaked faintly with the promise of dawn, though no warmth followed. A mist rolled off the moorland and wove between the trees of the orchard, like silent sentries watching over the right. Holmes had insisted we work quickly, before word could spread, before others could interfere, before the rising sun fell too far upon the earth and stirred some echo we could not comprehend. Inspector Braithwaite had brought two of his most trusted men, local constables, who asked no questions when handed shovels and directed to the old vault beneath the orchard. Miss Morton remained nearby, wrapped in a heavy cloak, pale but composed. I had worried for her strength. She had been at the very centre of this mystery, a witness to more than either Holmes or I had seen, but she bore herself with quiet determination. Holmes, ever meticulous, had prepared a
method. The cube, skull, and mirror had been rewrapped in thick layers of lead foil, followed by clay and pitch, then locked within a triple-walled iron casket. He had designed it himself and had it constructed at a forge in Whitechapel 2 nights earlier, working without rest. Now it stood before the open grave in the earth like a coffin for something older than death. "No inscription," he said, "no mark. Let it be forgotten." The casket was lowered into the earth with the help of ropes, resting upon the very stone slab that once formed the lid of the sarcophagus in the vault. Once down, we began filling in the grave by hand. No words were spoken. The sound of spades was the only rhythm, wet earth falling into silence. When the final layer was levelled and the sod replaced, Holmes stepped back and folded his arms. "There," he said simply. "Let it remain." Braithwaite took off his hat and nodded. "I'll place men nearby for a week, just in case." "You won't need to," Holmes replied. "No one will come looking unless they know what to look for, and those who do won't return." We left Evercombe for the final time that morning. Miss Morton, after some insistence on my part, agreed to stay at a quiet retreat in Somerset, far from the museum, to rest and recover. Holmes ensured she was provided with a stipend from a private account, one I had never known he possessed. When I raised an eyebrow, he shrugged. "There are things more valuable than money," he said, "and sometimes a guardian must be cared for even after the storm." As we boarded the train for London, Holmes's energy seemed to drain from him. He sat by the window in silence, his face turned to the passing hedgerows and skeletal trees. The puzzle, once unravelled, had left behind no elation, only gravity. I let him be, content to smoke and reflect as the wheels clattered beneath us. We returned to Baker Street in time for the first post. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual blend of domestic concern and unspoken approval. Holmes nodded to her, accepted a tray of correspondence without comment, and retired to his room. He did not emerge again until evening. When he did, he was carrying a bundle of letters, correspondence from scholars and antiquarians across Europe, responding to the queries he had sent during the height of our investigation. He laid them on the table before the fire. "One thing is clear," he said. "The objects are not unique." I looked up sharply. "You mean there are more?" "Not necessarily copies, but cognates, symbols, rituals, containers. Each culture has its version, most of them broken, incomplete, or corrupted by time. But they speak of the same fear, the same memory." "Then we haven't solved anything," I said. "Only pushed it deeper underground." Holmes met my eyes. "Would you prefer it walked above ground?" "No," I admitted. "But I would prefer to know what we're dealing with." "So would I," Holmes said, and poured himself a measure of brandy. We did not speak much that night. The fire burned low, and London outside our window bustled as usual, unknowing and unbothered. A part of me envied it, another part feared it. The following day brought news. Ezra Grohl was dead. The prison physician reported it as cardiac failure, but the details were unsettling. Grohl had become withdrawn after our visit, speaking only to himself in a hushed murmur. He was found at dawn, eyes wide open, mouth frozen mid-sentence. His cell contained a single note torn from the margin of a book. It read, "I saw it again. The mirror did not forget." Holmes said nothing when I read it aloud, but I saw his hands tighten on the edge of the table. 3 days later, Holmes awoke me before dawn. "Watson," he said, already dressed, "come, there is someone you must meet." We took a cab to Kensington and walked the final street on foot. The fog was dense, wrapping around gas lamps and casting halos of pale gold in the gloom. We arrived at a modest townhouse, well kept, but plain. Holmes knocked thrice in a particular pattern. The door opened a crack, then fully. A woman of perhaps 60 stood there, her hair snow-white, but her bearing strong. She smiled faintly. "So it has begun again." Holmes nodded. "May we come in, Miss Kestrel?" I blinked. "You know each other?" "We have corresponded for years," Holmes said. "She is the last living contact of Sir Julian Evercombe." We stepped inside. The sitting room was lined with shelves of books, none I recognized. Their spines bore titles in Greek, Coptic, Sanskrit. Maps adorned the walls, ancient ones, hand-drawn and annotated in faded ink. Miss Kestrel served tea and sat opposite us. "You found the mirror," she said to Holmes. We did. "And the skull?" "Also." Her eyes dimmed. "Then it has shifted." I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "These objects," she said, "are not accidents. They emerge when they are needed, or when they are feared most. Their reappearance is a reaction, a symptom." "To what?" I asked. "To imbalance," she said. "Something tipping too far in the wrong direction, of belief, or knowledge, or will." Holmes was silent, listening intently. Miss Kestrel continued. "Sir Julian tried to warn us. He feared what would come when the mirror found its face again, but you've delayed it. That matters." "And what now?" I asked. She looked to Holmes. "That," she said, "is for him to decide." We left as the sun began to rise. The streets of London were stirring, but I felt as though we walked in a city few could see. Back on Baker Street, Holmes stood at the window, gazing out at the rooftops. "You will write this down, won't you?" he said suddenly. I turned. Of course. But who would believe it? They need not believe it, but they must remember. Memory is a kind of protection, Watson, even if it's mistaken for fiction. He turned from the window and gave me a thin smile. "Now," he said, "let's have breakfast." And that was the end, or perhaps the pause, of what I would call the strangest case we ever undertook. Not a crime of motive, or greed, or vengeance, but a case of knowledge, too much of it perhaps, or the wrong kind at the wrong time. I wrote it all down, just as Holmes asked, but I did not publish it. Some stories are not meant for the Strand. Some truths are best kept behind mirrors. It was several weeks before Holmes returned to any semblance of his usual rhythm. During that time, we had no clients. He refused every summons, politely but firmly, even those from influential quarters. The only cases he permitted were those of pure criminal design, theft, blackmail, a forged signature or two. Nothing metaphysical, nothing that trembled on the edge of reason. I watched him closely, as I always did after such episodes. He did not retreat into his violin, nor collapse into morbid ennui. But he had changed. He read more in the early hours, esoteric texts I could barely decipher. And once, late at night, I found him burning a sheaf of notes in the fireplace, watching them curl and vanish with an unreadable expression. There were no more letters from Miss Morton, though a brief telegram confirmed she was safely installed in a coastal village near Whitby. She had resumed writing, she said, but only fiction. Holmes approved. One particularly grey morning, as I sat reading the paper, and Holmes pored over a monograph on Assyrian burial rites, I asked him what still troubled him most about the case. He didn't respond at once. He set the book down and regarded me with a weary intensity. "It's not the mirror," he said, "nor the skull, nor even the cube." I waited. "It's the pattern, the idea that all of this may not be extraordinary but cyclical, that these elements, objects, symbols, rituals, aren't rare relics but inevitable returns, like tidal forces. That, Watson, unsettles me." He stood and crossed to the window. "Ever since we resealed the vault, I've been haunted not by what we saw, but by what we might have started." I said nothing. Holmes did not use the word haunted lightly. Every civilization has its myths of sight and blindness, of gates and guardians, he continued. In the Norse sagas, in the Vedic hymns, in Babylonian fragments too old to name, there's always a moment when knowledge and perception overtake the vessel holding them. What if we were simply another iteration? I looked down at my paper. The Daily Telegraph says Scotland Yard is searching for a missing curate from Shoreditch and a Russian spiritualist arrested for fraud. Holmes chuckled dryly. "Ah, yes, sanity's comfortable distractions." He returned to his chair and picked up his pipe, though he did not light it. Instead, he began sifting through a pile of papers I had seen him avoid for days. At the top was a letter, thick, wax-sealed, its writing delicate and foreign. He opened it and read silently for a time, then passed it to me. It was written in French, dated from Marseille, and signed by a woman named C. Valence, Monsieur Holmes. "Your inquiries into the mirror and skull have not gone unnoticed. There are those who remember the symbols, though they dare not speak them. One of our number, an antiquarian near Lyon, died last week under circumstances most unusual. His rooms were locked from within, yet all the mirrors had shattered. One object was missing, a bronze disc inscribed in the same concentric patterns you described. I believe the cycle has already begun. If you wish to understand its breadth, you must come south. There is more buried than bones." "Well," I said, folding the letter, "it seems you were right." Holmes nodded. "Of course, Patterns, Watson, always patterns. I felt a chill. Are you going? Eventually, but not yet. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for the right alignment of the stars. Waiting for the right time, he corrected. A puzzle does not yield under force. It opens when its locks align. That night, I had a dream I would not soon forget. I stood in the orchard at Evercombe Hall. The trees were bare, the sky heavy with stars that pulsed like breathing eyes. I was alone, or thought I was, until I saw a faint glimmer through the trees, the mirror. Not propped or framed or hung, but floating, just hanging in the air, humming faintly. I approached it against my better judgment and peered in. My reflection looked back, but not truly mine. A version of me that did not blink when I did, whose face was pale and mouth just slightly parted, as though whispering something I could not hear. And then, behind the mirror, another face. Holmes's, but his eyes were closed. When I woke, the fireplace in our sitting room had gone out. The coals were cold, though I distinctly remembered it burning before I retired. Holmes was seated at his desk, staring into nothing. He looked up, calm but alert. "Did you dream?" he asked. I hesitated. "Yes." I thought so. The mirror leaves echoes, not just in sight, but in memory. The days passed. We resumed a few cases. Petty theft, a missing pearl earring in Belgravia, a misunderstanding between a tailor and a debtor, all neatly solved and all deeply beneath Holmes's usual appetites. But perhaps that was the point, normalcy as an aesthetic. One evening we received word that Sir Julian's private correspondence had been published posthumously in a limited academic edition. Holmes received a copy by post and read it in silence for 2 hours. Then, without a word, he placed it in a tin box, locked it, and deposited it in the hearth with instructions to Mrs. Hudson that it not be opened again, not even by him. And so life continued, uneventful, in the way life often does after the unimaginable. But there were signs, small ones. The postman who swore he saw a second shadow following Holmes up the stairs when none could have cast it. A street vendor who refused to take Holmes's coin, saying it was too cold, though the day was warm. A woman who claimed, passing by 221B Baker Street, that she caught a glimpse of someone at the window, someone who looked like Holmes but not quite. Holmes paid these little accounts no heed, or rather he logged them silently somewhere behind those keen grey eyes. But I noticed that he had taken to avoiding mirrors altogether. Our shaving stand in the washroom, covered with a black cloth, the hall mirror, turned to face the wall. Even his pocket watch had been changed, now with a matte black cover that reflected nothing at all. One night I confronted him. "You saw something," I said, "when you touched the mirror in the vault." He met my gaze, calm, unflinching. "Yes," he said. "And I saw possibilities," he said. "Paths. Some led here, some did not, but one in particular has never left me." I waited. "In one," he said slowly, "I was not me, but I remembered being me." He took a long breath. "And I could hear your voice, not here, but beside me." I felt a sudden, unaccountable grief then, as though something had been decided long ago without my knowing it. "Holmes," I said softly, "what do we do if it comes back?" He was silent for a moment. Then he smiled, not his usual sharp, wry smile, but something softer, sadder. "Then we meet it again, with reason, with vigilance, with the knowledge that we once turned it away." He tapped the side of his temple. "And with memory, Watson, because that is our greatest defense, not the mirror, not the vault, but the fact that we remember." I nodded. "I do remember, and I have written it all down, not for publication, not for profit, but for preservation, for some future when the stars tilt again, and the orchard stirs beneath moonlight, and the skull and mirror and gate whisper from the dark. If that day comes, may these words reach the one who reads them. May you see it in time, may you close the path, and if you look into the mirror, do not linger. It was a month to the day since we had sealed the vault beneath Evercombe Hall, when Inspector Lestrade appeared at our door, unannounced and dusted with the grime of hurried travel. He looked nervous, a rare state for Lestrade, who could stand unblinking beside corpses without the faintest shift of expression. "There's something I need you to see, Mr. Holmes," he said, barely pausing for breath. "And I think it relates to your recent absence from public cases." Holmes, who had been repotting a rare orchid on the sitting-room table, carefully set down the shears and stood. "Where?" "A gallery in Whitechapel. There was a break-in. Odd, clean, nothing taken." But the curator found a note on her desk, just 2 words. He drew a folded slip of paper from his pocket and handed it to Holmes. In delicate ink was written, "Second reflection." Holmes turned the paper in his hand, studying it with no visible reaction. "Anything else?" "Yes," Lestrade said. "The security camera, newly installed, caught something, only 1 frame, but—" He trailed off, producing a photograph. Holmes took it. Even I felt a chill. It showed the museum's modern hallway, the lights stark and clinical. In the glass of a display case, just for a moment, there was a figure, tall, lean, cloaked. It looked very much like Sherlock Holmes, but it could not have been. He had been at Baker Street all that night, in my presence, reading an obscure tract on Turkish funerary rites. Holmes stared at it a long moment. Then he placed the photograph on the mantel beside a row of dusty Persian figurines and turned away. "Thank you, Lestrade," he said. "There is no crime to pursue, yet. Only a question." Lestrade gave me a baffled look. I nodded. It was best not to ask further. Once he had gone, Holmes stood before the hearth, hands clasped behind him. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "the final piece has turned." "You think it's begun again?" He nodded. "I believe the mirror did more than reflect. I believe it impressed." "Impressed what?" "Possibility," he said softly. "Somewhere, perhaps in another place, perhaps only in the mind, something remembered me. Not just as I am, but as I could be. And now that possibility echoes." I struggled to find words. "What do we do?" Holmes turned. There was no fear in his expression, only certainty. "We watch, we remember, and if the echo becomes voice, if the image becomes substance, we meet it, not as strangers, but as ourselves." He retrieved the photograph, studied it once more, then placed it in the tin box where he had locked away Sir Julian's diary, the Elric translation, and the last remnants of the case we dared not name. He sealed it, marked it, buried it in the wall behind the bookshelves, and then, without flourish, he returned to his orchid. "Some mysteries," he said, "are not solved, they are outlived." I sat quietly by the window, watching the rain begin to fall on Baker Street. Pedestrians moved past, umbrellas raised, unaware of the quiet storm that had broken, and passed through the world like a dream. And Holmes, Sherlock Holmes, detective, logician, guardian of reason, trimmed his orchid with perfect calm. Whatever walked behind the glass, whatever whispered through time and shadow, it would not find him unprepared. He had seen the second reflection and turned away.